The halls of the Washington County Courthouse had always been a stage for drama, but nothing quite like what unfolded on that crisp autumn morning when Pamela Bondi strode through the heavy oak doors. Her tailored navy suit and confident posture belied the turmoil she felt inside, knowing that her reputation, built meticulously over 15 years of legal practice, was about to be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. The case was supposed to be straightforward, a pro bono defense for a small business owner facing unjust eviction. But circumstances had conspired against her, and now she was walking into courtroom 7 already labeled as contemptuous in the eyes of Judge Harrison Blake. Judge Blake's reputation preceded him throughout legal circles in the Pacific Northwest. A man of unwavering principles and exacting standards, he ran his courtroom with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and expected nothing less than perfection from those who practiced before him. At 58, his salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes had witnessed countless attorneys rise and fall based on their merits, their preparation, and most importantly, their respect for the court. The judge had no patience for tardiness, disorganization, or what he perceived as disrespect. All strikes that Pamela Bondi now had against her name before she'd even presented a single argument. The morning's court docket had her name highlighted in red, a visual reminder of her failure to submit key documents by the mandated deadline. Neither Pamela nor Judge Blake could have foreseen how their professional collision course would reshape not only their respective careers but also the very nature of justice in Washington County. The political undercurrents, the personal vendettas, and the shocking revelations that would emerge in the coming weeks remained hidden beneath the surface, like fault lines waiting for the precise moment to rupture. And as Pamela settled her briefcase on the defense table, straightening papers with slightly trembling hands, the courthouse clock struck 9, signaling the beginning of what would become known throughout legal circles as the Bondi precedent, a case study that would be discussed in law schools for generations to come. Pamela Bondi had never intended to be late with her filings. The cascade of events leading to this moment had begun 3 days earlier when her laptop had crashed, taking with it the nearly completed motion for summary judgment she'd been perfecting for her client, Eleanor Michaels. A 67-year-old widow who ran a small bookshop that doubled as a community gathering space, Eleanor faced eviction by Westridge Development Corporation, a behemoth real estate company intent on demolishing the historic building to make way for luxury condominiums. The case had immediately spoken to Pamela's sense of justice, a David versus Goliath battle where the law, if properly applied, could actually protect the underdog. Working through 2 sleepless nights, Pamela had reconstructed her arguments, gathered additional precedents, and prepared what she believed was an airtight case against the eviction. Then came the call that her father had been hospitalized. Racing 3 hours to Bellingham where he lived alone since her mother's passing, Pamela had spent a terrifying night in the emergency room as doctors ruled out a heart attack and eventually diagnosed a severe case of pneumonia. By the time she felt confident enough in his stabilized condition to return to her case, the filing deadline had passed. Her emergency motion for extension, hastily sent from her phone in the hospital cafeteria, had apparently never reached the clerk's office due to an email server outage. The perfect storm of technological and personal disasters had culminated in what Judge Blake's preliminary ruling called an inexcusable dereliction of procedural responsibility, along with a staggering $5,000 fine for contempt. Eleanor Michaels sat in the first row of the gallery, her weathered hands clutching a handkerchief, eyes reflecting both fear and unwavering faith in the attorney who had promised to save her livelihood. Behind her sat a phalanx of community members, students who used the bookshop as a study haven, retirees who gathered for weekly book clubs, and young families who attended the Saturday morning reading circles. Their presence added weight to Pamela's shoulders as she organized her notes, knowing that she wasn't just fighting for one woman's business but for a community institution. Across the aisle, Westridge Development's legal team sprawled confidently across 2 tables. 5 attorneys in identically expensive suits flanked by paralegals and assistants all armed with tablets and leather portfolios. Judge Harrison Blake entered the courtroom with the same measured cadence he'd maintained for 23 years on the bench. As the bailiff called for all to rise, Blake's gaze immediately found Pamela, lingering just long enough to communicate his disappointment before he took his seat. The irony wasn't lost on her that this judge, known for his tough but fair reputation, had once been her idol. During law school, she'd attended every public lecture he gave, had studied his most influential decisions, and had even cited his reasoning in her law review article on property rights versus community interests. Now, as he shuffled through the case files with a deepening frown, she realized that her professional admiration might actually work against her. Judge Blake had a particular disdain for attorneys he believed should know better, and Pamela Bondi, graduated summa cum laude, former judicial clerk, and recipient of the State Bar's Pro Bono Attorney of the Year award, definitely should have known better. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Judge Blake cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and addressed the room with the commanding presence that had earned him the nickname the Benchmark among the legal community. His voice, resonant and measured, carried to every corner as he began with a summary of the case, methodically outlining the issues at hand as if setting the stage for what everyone present knew would be a difficult proceeding. He noted the community interest in the case, acknowledging the packed gallery with a brief nod, before turning his attention to the matter of Pamela Bondi's procedural violations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as he recounted, with clinical precision, each missed deadline and filing error, culminating in his decision to levy the fine, an amount that he emphasized was actually restrained given the potential prejudice to opposing counsel's preparation. Westridge Development's lead attorney, Maxwell Richardson, rose with the practiced ease of someone who had argued hundreds of similar cases. His silver hair and bespoke suit projected an image of success and authority as he smoothly expressed his client's sympathies for Ms. Bondi's personal circumstances while simultaneously emphasizing the importance of procedural rules. Richardson's presentation was flawless, each point building logically to his conclusion that the court had no choice but to exclude Pamela's late filings and grant summary judgment for the eviction to proceed. His argument was devoid of emotion yet subtly played to the gallery's fears. Redevelopment meant progress, jobs, economic growth. The bookshop, while charming, was simply an outdated business model occupying valuable real estate that could better serve the community's future needs. Pamela listened to Richardson's argument with outward composure that masked her racing thoughts. Years of courtroom experience had taught her to recognize when a judge was leaning away from her position, and Blake's body language, the slight forward tilt when Richardson spoke, the occasional nod, signaled trouble. When her turn came to speak, Pamela rose slowly, taking a moment to center herself before addressing the court. She began not with excuses for her tardiness, but with the legal substance of her argument, a strategic decision that immediately caught Blake's attention. Rather than dwelling on procedural matters, she dove directly into the heart of her defense. That Westridge's eviction notice violated both the letter and spirit of Washington's Historic Building Preservation Act, a statute that Judge Blake himself had helped strengthen through his previous rulings. The shift in the courtroom's energy was subtle but unmistakable as Pamela methodically built her case. She referenced 3 landmark decisions, including one of Blake's most celebrated opinions, establishing that buildings designated as community cultural spaces required heightened protection from development interests. Eleanor's bookshop, housed in a structure dating back to 1887 that had survived the Great Fire of 1910, qualified under every criterion of the statute. What began as a routine eviction case was transforming, through Pamela's careful argumentation, into a question of cultural preservation versus unchecked development. Judge Blake's expression remained impassive, but his pen moved quickly across his notepad, and he had yet to interrupt her flow, a marked departure from his usual style of aggressive questioning and a sign that Pamela was possibly regaining ground despite her procedural missteps. By the time Pamela concluded her initial argument, citing Washington Supreme Court precedent that perfectly aligned with her client's circumstances, the atmosphere in Courtroom 7 had transformed. The community members in attendance sat straighter, hope rekindling in their expressions, while Westridge's legal team huddled in whispered consultation. Judge Blake removed his reading glasses, studied Pamela for a long moment, then asked a single question that sent a ripple of tension through the room. "Counselor, are you arguing that I should overlook your procedural failures because you believe the substantive merits of your case are compelling?" The question hung in the air, a perfectly laid trap between procedure and justice, and Pamela knew her answer would determine not just Eleanor's fate, but potentially her own career trajectory as well. Pamela drew a careful breath, recognizing the pivotal nature of the judge's question. With deliberate precision, She addressed not just Blake but the principles she knew he held dear. No, she was not asking for procedural rules to be ignored. In fact, she fully accepted the court's sanction and would pay the fine without contest. What she was proposing was more nuanced. That the court had discretion to accept late filings when the interests of justice significantly outweighed the harm caused by the delay. From her briefcase, she produced a comprehensive timeline demonstrating that Westridge had known about their planned development for over 3 years, but had strategically waited until the holiday season to serve eviction notices, presumably to minimize community opposition. This calculated timing, she argued, constituted a form of procedural manipulation far more egregious than her own deadline missed due to family emergency. The courtroom remained absolutely still as Pamela continued, her voice gaining strength with each carefully constructed point. She directed the court's attention to a recent amendment to the Washington Rules of Civil Procedure, one that Judge Blake himself had advocated for during his tenure on the Rules Committee, which explicitly granted judges discretion in extraordinary circumstances where rigid procedural adherence would result in manifest injustice. As she spoke, she distributed copies of the amendment, along with 3 case studies where courts had exercised this discretion. The strategic brilliance of her approach was becoming apparent. She was acknowledging her error while simultaneously offering the judge a legally sound pathway to consider her substantive arguments without appearing to bend his own rules. Judge Blake's fingers drummed lightly on the bench as he reviewed the materials, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. For the first time since entering the courtroom, a flicker of respect crossed his features. Maxwell Richardson, sensing the shift in momentum, rose quickly to object, arguing that Pamela was attempting to circumvent clear procedural rules with emotional appeals. His objection, delivered with practiced indignation, fell flat as Blake raised a hand to silence him. The judge turned to Pamela with narrowed eyes and posed a challenge that sent murmurs through the gallery. If she could cite the specific paragraph and page number of his own opinion in Westlake Historical Society versus Modern Ventures where he had articulated the balance between procedural compliance and substantive justice, he would consider her motion for reconsideration. Without hesitation, Pamela replied, "Page 47, paragraph 3, Your Honor," and proceeded to quote verbatim, "When procedural requirements conflict with the court's fundamental obligation to see justice done, procedure must bend, not break, to accommodate the greater purpose of our legal system." The quote was precisely accurate, and more importantly, it was from an opinion Blake had written early in his judicial career, one that reflected ideals perhaps tempered by decades on the bench but never publicly repudiated. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly surprised that Pamela had not only met his challenge but had strategically selected a quote that reflected his own published judicial philosophy. Richardson's objection died on his lips as Blake nodded slowly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The remainder of the morning proceeded with a palpable shift in the courtroom dynamics. Judge Blake, while maintaining his characteristic sternness, began asking pointed questions of Westridge's legal team, questions that revealed potential weaknesses in their position that had not been evident before. He requested clarification on ownership transfers, pressed for details on community impact studies, and inquired about alternative development plans that might accommodate the historic bookshop. Each question built upon Pamela's arguments without explicitly endorsing them, creating a foundation for what she recognized as judicial skepticism toward Westridge's case. By noon, when Blake called for a recess until the following morning, Eleanor Michaels was trembling with cautious hope, and the community members were exchanging glances of tentative optimism. As the courtroom cleared, Pamela caught Judge Blake watching her with an inscrutable expression, not quite approval, but perhaps a reassessment of the attorney he had so quickly dismissed as merely careless. The recess provided no respite for Pamela. While the courtroom emptied around her, Maxwell Richardson approached with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to backroom negotiations. Speaking just loudly enough for nearby parties to overhear, he offered what he termed a generous compromise, 3 months for Eleanor to vacate instead of 30 days. Plus a relocation stipend that amounted to less than a month's rent in the increasingly expensive downtown district. His smile never reached his eyes as he suggested that Pamela should advise her client to accept, adding with practiced concern that prolonging the inevitable only depletes Ms. Michaels' limited resources. The implied threat hung between them. Westridge could afford a protracted legal battle. Eleanor Michaels could not. Pamela thanked him for the offer with professional courtesy that masked her internal calculation. Richardson's approach suggested that Westridge was less confident than they appeared, and that Judge Blake's questions had rattled them. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered on the steps. Local news cameras captured Eleanor embracing community supporters while Pamela stood slightly apart, reviewing notes and fielding calls from her legal assistant regarding her father's condition. When approached by a reporter asking for a statement, she declined to discuss specifics but emphasized the case's significance beyond a single eviction. This is about whether our community values its history and culture enough to protect it from being erased in the name of progress. The soundbite would lead the evening news, framing the narrative as David versus Goliath rather than a technical legal dispute. Exactly the public perception Pamela needed to maintain pressure on Westridge's corporate image. As the crowd dispersed, she noticed a courthouse clerk approaching with an envelope bearing the official seal of Judge Blake's chambers. The hand-delivered note contained instructions that sent Pamela's mind racing. Judge Blake was requesting both parties to submit, by 7 a.m. the following morning, briefings on a seemingly obscure legal question. Whether the historic designation of Eleanor's building triggered enhanced protections under a rarely invoked subsection of state law related to cultural heritage preservation in commercial contexts. Pamela immediately recognized the significance. Blake was offering a potential legal pathway that neither side had explicitly addressed in their arguments. While Richardson would have a team of associates working through the night, she would be preparing alone while also checking on her father and addressing the mountain of work that had accumulated during her absence from her small practice. The judge was testing not just her legal knowledge but her stamina and commitment. The next 12 hours became a blur of frantic research, coffee, and determination. Pamela converted a corner table at the hospital cafeteria into a makeshift office, dividing her attention between visiting her improving father and diving deep into legal databases. The subsection Blake referenced had only been invoked 3 times in Washington state history, twice unsuccessfully and once in a case that settled before judicial opinion. However, similar provisions in Oregon and California had generated more substantial case law, providing persuasive precedent she could leverage. Working methodically through the night, she constructed an argument that not only addressed Blake's specific question, but expanded it into a comprehensive framework for balancing development needs with cultural preservation. By dawn, bleary-eyed but triumphant, she had produced a 20-page brief that transformed what had begun as a straightforward eviction into a potential landmark case on community rights. As morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, Pamela arrived 30 minutes early, brief in hand, to find Maxwell Richardson already waiting outside courtroom A. The shadows under his eyes and the slightly rumpled appearance of his otherwise immaculate suit suggested that Westridge's legal team had also had a sleepless night. They exchanged professional nods as they submitted their respective briefs to the clerk, each aware that the day's proceedings would likely determine the case's trajectory. What neither of them noticed was Judge Blake observing their arrival from his chamber window, or the thoughtful expression that crossed his face as he watched Pamela straighten her shoulders and enter the courtroom with the quiet dignity of someone who had found her footing again. As the bailiff called the court to order and Blake took his seat, his opening remarks stunned both attorneys. Having reviewed the emergency briefs submitted this morning, I find myself with additional questions regarding the historical significance of the property in question. Before proceeding further, this court will conduct a site visit to the premises this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Counsel for both parties will attend. With those words, the battle moved from the abstract realm of legal theory to the physical reality of Eleanor's beloved bookshop, a development that no one, least of all Pamela Bondi, had anticipated. The announcement of the site visit sent ripples of surprise through the courtroom. Site visits were exceedingly rare in civil proceedings, particularly for a judge of Blake's stature and busy calendar. As the gallery cleared, Pamela caught a glimpse of Maxwell Richardson's face. The momentary flash of concern before his professional mask slid back into place told her everything she needed to know. Westridge's strategy had been built around keeping the case abstract, focused on property rights and development potential rather than on Eleanor Michaels and her beloved community space. The judge's decision to see the bookshop firsthand threatened to humanize what Richardson had carefully framed as a straightforward business transaction. Taking advantage of the unexpected development, Pamela approached Eleanor with renewed energy, instructing her to contact the community members who regularly used the bookshop. Without being obvious about orchestrating a show of community support, she wanted Judge Blake to see the space as it truly functioned, a living, breathing cultural hub rather than merely an aging retail establishment. By 1:30 that afternoon, Pamela arrived at Michael's Memories and Manuscripts to find Eleanor nervously straightening already immaculate shelves. The bookshop occupied the ground floor of a Victorian-era building with original hardwood floors that creaked welcomingly and tall windows that bathed the interior in natural light. Built-in bookshelves reached to the ceiling, accessible by rolling ladders that children loved to carefully maneuver under supervision. The central space featured reading nooks with well-worn leather chairs, while the back room had been converted into a community gathering space where local authors gave readings, book clubs met, and twice weekly, Eleanor hosted free literacy classes for adults working to improve their reading skills. Every surface told a story, from the antique cash register that still functioned perfectly to the collection of first editions displayed in glass cases. The building itself was a character in Eleanor's life story, having been purchased by her grandparents in 1923 and passed down through generations. Judge Blake arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, his black robe exchanged for a conservative charcoal suit that still managed to convey his judicial authority. He was accompanied by his law clerk, a serious young woman who carried a stenographer's pad, and the court reporter, who brought portable equipment to create an official record of the visit. Maxwell Richardson appeared moments later flanked by 2 associates and a man Pamela recognized as Victor Harrington, Westridge Development's CEO. Blake acknowledged everyone with formal nods before addressing Eleanor directly, requesting that she guide them through the space and explain its functions and history. As Eleanor began her tour, speaking with passionate knowledge about the building's architectural features and historical significance, Pamela observed Blake closely. The judge's expression remained impassive, but his attention was complete. He asked questions about structural elements, examined the original crown moldings, and ran a hand appreciatively along a banister crafted by a local woodworker in 1889. The seemingly choreographed nature of what happened next could never have been planned. As Eleanor led the group toward the community room at the back, the front door chimed, and a stream of regular patrons began to arrive. A retired history professor engaged Judge Blake in conversation about a rare local history text only available at Eleanor's shop. A group of high school students settled into their regular after-school study corner, while a young mother arrived for the weekly parent-child reading circle. Blake observed it all, asking occasional questions of the patrons about how long they had been coming to the shop and what it meant to them. When a gray-haired man in his 80s approached Eleanor and thanked her for ordering his heart medication from the pharmacy next door, since he had difficulty walking the extra block, Pamela saw something shift in Blake's expression. A recognition that this space functioned as more than just a business. Richardson attempted to steer the conversation back to property values and development potential, but the human activity unfolding around them made his economic arguments seem hollow in comparison. The defining moment came in the community room, where Eleanor had displayed a timeline of the building's history alongside photographs spanning decades. One black-and-white image from 1967 showed a much younger Harrison Blake receiving a student literary award in that very room. Eleanor, who had organized the community archives meticulously, explained that the bookshop had hosted the county's Young Writers Competition for over 50 years. Blake stood motionless before the photograph, studying his younger self, while the court reporter and law clerk exchanged glances of surprise. The personal connection was unexpected, and Pamela watched as the judge's professional detachment momentarily faltered. He asked Eleanor a single question that resounded with potential significance. "Ms. Michaels, in your estimation, what would be lost if this space were to be replaced with modern development?" Eleanor's answer, simple, honest, and devoid of legal calculation, laid out the human cost in terms no property valuation could quantify. As they prepared to leave, Blake announced that court would reconvene the following morning for final arguments, his tone giving no indication of which way he was leaning. But Pamela, watching him take one last look at the community room, sensed that their site visit had accomplished what no legal brief could. It had connected the abstract principles of law to the concrete reality of lives that would be affected by his decision. The morning after the site visit brought unexpected complications. Pamela arrived at the courthouse to find Maxwell Richardson and his team huddled with Victor Harrington in intense discussion. Their usual composure had given way to gestures of frustration, and Harrington's face was flushed with what appeared to be anger. When they noticed her approach, the conversation abruptly ceased, but Richardson's tight smile and overly cordial greeting signaled that something significant had changed in Westridge's strategy. Before she could ponder this further, her phone rang. It was her associate calling with news that her father had taken a turn for the worse overnight, developing a fever that concerned his doctors. Torn between her professional obligations and personal worry, Pamela made a quick call to the hospital, speaking directly with her father's physician who assured her that while the situation required monitoring, it wasn't critical enough to warrant immediate departure. With a heavy heart but strengthened resolve, she entered the courtroom, knowing that today's arguments might determine not just Eleanor's future, but potentially her own professional standing as well. Judge Blake entered the courtroom with the same measured dignity as always, but observers familiar with his demeanor might have noticed subtle differences. He appeared more contemplative than stern, his customary intimidating presence softened almost imperceptibly. After the formalities of bringing the court to session, he announced a modification to the day's proceedings. Rather than moving directly to final arguments, he wished to address several points of law that had been raised in the parties' overnight briefings. What followed was an hour of extraordinarily detailed questioning directed primarily at Westridge's legal team. Blake pressed them on the applicability of the cultural heritage preservation statutes, challenging their narrow interpretation with references to legislative history that suggested broader protective intent. Richardson, masterful lawyer that he was, parried effectively, but the direction of the judge's inquiry revealed that Pamela's arguments had found purchase in Blake's legal reasoning. When the questioning turned to her, she was prepared for the same intensity but was surprised when Blake asked just one multi-part question centered on balancing community interests against property development rights, a question that perfectly aligned with the framework she had developed in her brief. The momentum shifted dramatically when Victor Harrington requested permission to address the court directly. Judge Blake, after a moment's consideration, granted the unusual request, and Westridge's CEO approached the podium with the confident bearing of someone unaccustomed to being denied. In carefully measured tones that nevertheless conveyed underlying frustration, Harrington announced that in the interest of community relations, Westridge was prepared to modify its development plans to incorporate the bookshop's facade into the new building design and to offer Eleanor Michaels a retail space in the completed development at below-market rent for a period of 5 years. The proposal, presented as a generous compromise, was clearly intended to position Westridge as reasonable and community-minded, while still achieving their essential development goals. Pamela recognized it immediately for what it was: a strategic retreat prompted by concern over how Judge Blake's questioning had been trending, coupled with the public relations risk of being portrayed as destroying a beloved community institution. The courtroom buzzed with whispered reactions as Eleanor leaned forward, her expression conflicted. Judge Blake called for silence before turning to Pamela, asking whether her client wished to consider the offer before proceeding with final arguments. It was a pivotal moment. Accepting would guarantee Eleanor something rather than risking everything on a judicial decision that remained uncertain, regardless of how favorably the morning had proceeded. After a brief consultation with her client, Pamela returned to the podium with Eleanor standing beside her for support. With calm determination, she thanked Westridge for the offer but declined on her client's behalf, explaining that the proposal failed to address the fundamental issue: the historical and community significance of the building itself, not merely its facade or the business it housed. The building's interior features, the hand-carved woodwork, original flooring, and architectural details, were as historically significant as its exterior. Furthermore, the community functions served by the space required the specific layout and character of the original structure. In essence, she argued, the compromise offered preservation in name only while still destroying the substance of what made the space culturally significant. Judge Blake nodded thoughtfully, neither approving nor disapproving of the decision, and called for a 30-minute recess before final arguments. As the courtroom cleared, Maxwell Richardson approached Pamela with a new intensity. Speaking just loudly enough for nearby parties to overhear, he expressed disbelief at her reckless advice to reject a generous offer, suggesting that she was putting her own emerging reputation as a defender of community interests ahead of her client's best outcome. The implication was clear. He was setting the stage to portray her as self-serving if Eleanor ultimately lost everything. Pamela maintained her composure, responding only that she and her client had made their decision based on principle rather than expediency. As Richardson walked away, she noticed Judge Blake's law clerk lingering nearby, having clearly overheard the exchange. The young woman's expression remained professionally neutral, but the slight nod she gave Pamela before returning to chambers carried an unmistakable message of respect. Sometimes, standing firm on principle was its own victory, regardless of the outcome. With renewed determination, Pamela gathered her notes for the final argument, knowing that the next hour would test not just her legal reasoning, but her ability to articulate why some community values transcended monetary calculation. Final arguments began with Maxwell Richardson presenting a masterclass in persuasive legal reasoning. He acknowledged the community's attachment to the bookshop but framed it as emotional rather than legal, emphasizing that zoning laws and property rights existed precisely to prevent sentimental considerations from interfering with necessary urban development. With practiced eloquence, he presented Westridge's compromise offer as evidence of their good faith and community-mindedness, while subtly suggesting that Pamela's rejection of it demonstrated a lack of pragmatic judgment. His argument wove together economic projections, tax revenue increases, job creation figures, and housing development goals from the city's own master plan, creating a compelling narrative of progress that positioned the bookshop as a charming but ultimately dispensable relic of the past. Richardson closed by reminding Judge Blake that courts had consistently upheld the rights of property owners to develop their assets within zoning guidelines, and that allowing subjective cultural value assessments to override these rights would create dangerous precedent that could paralyze urban renewal efforts throughout the state. When Pamela rose for her final argument, the weight of the moment settled around her shoulders like a familiar cloak. Rather than beginning with legal citations, she started with a question directed at the court. What is the purpose of law in our society? The unexpected philosophical opening caught everyone's attention, including Judge Blake, who leaned forward slightly. Pamela continued, building her argument on the foundation that law existed not merely to enforce rules, but to protect values that communities deemed worthy of preservation. The cultural heritage statutes at issue in this case represented a legislative determination that certain historical and community spaces deserved protection even when market forces might dictate their replacement. Her argument transitioned seamlessly between legal analysis and human impact, citing specific provisions while connecting them to the tangible benefits that Eleanor's bookshop provided: literacy programs that supplemented underfunded schools, community gathering spaces in a neighborhood losing its public areas to privatization, and living history that connected current residents to their community's past. As Pamela's argument built toward its conclusion, she directly addressed the economic reasoning that formed the backbone of Westridge's position. Drawing on research she had compiled during her sleepless night in the hospital cafeteria, she presented evidence from urban planning studies showing that neighborhoods retaining historical and cultural landmarks actually experienced more sustainable economic growth over time than those that underwent complete redevelopment. Preservation of community character, she argued, created distinctive neighborhoods that attracted both residents and businesses, generating economic value that went beyond the immediate profits of new construction. She acknowledged the importance of development but advocated for balanced approaches that integrated new growth with historical preservation, approaches that Westridge had refused to meaningfully consider despite their technical feasibility, as demonstrated by similar projects in other cities. Judge Blake remained inscrutable throughout her presentation, but his questions revealed deep engagement with her arguments. When she cited the specific subsection of the Heritage Preservation Statute that governed buildings serving educational and cultural functions, he pressed her on whether a commercial bookshop truly qualified under provisions originally drafted with museums and libraries in mind. Her response was both legally precise and humanly compelling. Eleanor's establishment functioned as a de facto library for many community members who couldn't afford to purchase books but were welcome to read on-site, and its educational programs served populations often overlooked by official institutions. The statute's language, she argued, focused on function rather than formal designation, and the legislative history supported broader rather than narrower application. As she concluded her argument, connecting the specific case back to her opening question about law's purpose, Pamela felt the rare satisfaction of having presented her absolute best work under enormous pressure. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Blake removed his glasses and addressed both attorneys. Instead of rendering an immediate decision as was his usual practice, he announced that he would take the matter under advisement and issue his ruling the following Monday. The delay was unusual for Blake, known for his rapid decision-making, and sent ripples of speculation through the courtroom. As the session adjourned, Eleanor approached Pamela with tears in her eyes, expressing gratitude regardless of the outcome. Community members who had attended the proceedings surrounded them with words of support and appreciation, creating a moment of connection that transcended the legal battle. From across the courtroom, Pamela caught Victor Harrington watching the scene with an expression that mingled calculation with something that might have been genuine reflection. The week-long wait for Blake's decision would be excruciating, but Pamela had done everything humanly possible to protect Eleanor's legacy. Now, as she turned her attention back to her father's health situation, she could only hope that her legal strategy had been sound enough to withstand whatever counterarguments Richardson might have planted in Blake's mind during their final exchange. The days following the hearing unfolded in a blur of hospital visits and professional catch-up for Pamela. Her father's condition stabilized enough for transfer out of intensive care, allowing her to split her attention between his recovery and the backlog of work that had accumulated at her small practice. 3 days after the hearing, as she was reviewing files in her father's hospital room while he slept, she received an unexpected call from Judge Blake's law clerk. The young woman spoke formally, maintaining proper judicial distance, but her message was clear. She believed Pamela should know that Maxwell Richardson had requested a private meeting with Judge Blake, citing urgent matters related to case management that afternoon. Such meetings, while not explicitly prohibited when disclosed to all parties, were unusual and potentially concerning. The clerk offered no opinion about the meeting's purpose but emphasized that she felt professionally obligated to ensure all parties had the same information. Pamela thanked her for the courtesy call, her mind racing with possibilities ranging from legitimate administrative concerns to improper attempts at influence. After consulting with a respected ethics professor from her law school days, Pamela decided on a measured response. She filed a formal notice requesting that any ex parte communication related to substantive matters be documented and shared with all parties, citing the applicable rules of judicial conduct. The document was carefully worded to avoid any implication of impropriety, while serving notice that she was aware of and monitoring the situation. She had barely filed the notice when her phone rang again. This time it was Eleanor, her voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. A representative from Westridge Development had contacted her directly, bypassing Pamela entirely, with a substantially improved offer: full preservation of the bookshop building as a cultural anchor for their development, with Eleanor retaining ownership of her space under a condominium arrangement. The catch was that the offer expired at close of business that day and required Eleanor to sign a confidentiality agreement preventing her from discussing the terms with anyone, including her attorney, until after acceptance. The impropriety of Westridge approaching her client directly during active litigation sent Pamela into immediate action mode. Within an hour, she had drafted and filed an emergency motion for sanctions against Westridge for violation of ethical rules prohibiting direct contact with represented parties. The motion included a request for disclosure of any communications between Westridge or their counsel and the court that might have precipitated this sudden change in tactics. As she worked, a pattern was emerging that raised her suspicions. The timing of Richardson's meeting with Judge Blake, followed immediately by Westridge's end run around her to Eleanor, suggested coordination that bordered on improper influence. Yet without evidence, such suspicions remained dangerous speculation that could damage her professional standing if voiced publicly. She advised Eleanor to take no action on the offer until the court addressed the procedural violations, emphasizing that legitimate offers didn't come with gag orders and arbitrary deadlines designed to prevent legal consultation. The situation escalated dramatically the following morning when local news outlets reported that Judge Harrison Blake had recused himself from the case, citing newly discovered potential conflicts of interest, without further explanation. The case would be reassigned to another judge, delaying the ruling indefinitely. Hours later, Pamela received a copy of a motion filed by Westridge requesting that her emergency filing be sealed from public view due to unsubstantiated allegations that could cause reputational harm. The legal maneuvering had shifted from the merits of the case to procedural warfare, with Westridge apparently willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent public scrutiny of their tactics. As Pamela prepared her response to this latest development, she received yet another unexpected communication, an email from a paralegal who had recently left Richardson's firm, offering to meet privately regarding information that might be relevant to understanding recent developments in the Michaels case. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria where Pamela had spent so many hours working on Eleanor's case. The former paralegal, Jessica Winters, spoke cautiously, aware of the professional risks she was taking. According to Jessica, Victor Harrington and Judge Blake had connections that went beyond professional acquaintance. Harrington's private investment group had provided financing for a luxury resort development in which Blake held a significant interest through a family trust. While not technically required to be disclosed under narrow reading of recusal rules since the investment wasn't directly tied to Westridge development, the connection created precisely the appearance of impropriety that judicial ethics were designed to prevent. The paralegal explained that she had uncovered the connection while researching potential conflicts for an unrelated case and had brought it to Richardson's attention days before the site visit. Richardson had allegedly instructed her to bury the information, suggesting it would never become relevant. She had resigned shortly afterward, citing ethical concerns. As Jessica finished her account, she slid a folder across the table containing documentation of the financial connections, property records, investment group filings, and trust documents that created a clear, if complex, link between the judge and Westridge's CEO. The implications were staggering, potentially undermining not just the current proceedings, but raising questions about Blake's impartiality in other development cases. Pamela now faced an ethical dilemma of her own: how to use this information without destroying the reputation of a judge she had long admired, while still protecting her client's interests in a system that suddenly seemed far more compromised than she had ever imagined. The documentation provided by Jessica Winters represented both opportunity and danger for Pamela. After spending the night analyzing the financial records, she confirmed complex but undeniable connections between Judge Blake's family trust and Harrington's investment group. The ethical labyrinth before her offered no clear path. Using the information risked being perceived as attacking a respected judge's integrity, while ignoring it meant allowing potentially compromised proceedings to continue unchallenged. By morning, Pamela had formulated a strategy that balanced ethical obligations with strategic restraint. Rather than filing a motion alleging judicial misconduct, which would irreparably damage Blake's reputation, she drafted a carefully worded request for clarification of the judge's recusal grounds, attaching selected documents that indicated the financial connections without directly alleging impropriety. The filing requested that the new judge, once assigned, review these materials in camera, privately, without public disclosure, to determine whether additional remedial measures were warranted for procedural integrity. Judge Marina Vasquez, recently appointed to the bench after a distinguished career as a prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime, was assigned to the case the following day. Her reputation for meticulous attention to procedural fairness made her an ideal replacement under the circumstances. Within hours of receiving the case file, including Pamela's request for clarification, Judge Vasquez issued an order scheduling an emergency hearing for the following morning with specific instructions that both Pamela and Maxwell Richardson appear personally, without clients or associates. The order's formal language gave no indication of the judge's thinking, but the urgency and restricted attendance suggested serious concerns about the case's procedural history. Pamela spent the evening preparing for scenarios ranging from judicial reprimand for raising questions about a fellow judge to validation of her ethical concerns. The emergency hearing in Judge Vasquez's chambers bore none of the public drama of the previous court proceedings but carried far greater tension. The judge began by establishing ground rules that immediately set the tone. This was not a hearing on the merits of Eleanor's case, but a procedural inquiry into possible irregularities that might have compromised the judicial process. Judge Vasquez had reviewed the documents submitted by Pamela alongside the complete case record and had serious questions about the timing of various motions, meetings, and Judge Blake's recusal. Richardson immediately objected to what he characterized as improper insinuations about judicial conduct by opposing counsel, but Vasquez cut him off with the crisp precision that had made her a formidable prosecutor. This was her court, her inquiry, and she would determine what questions required answers before the case could proceed properly. What followed was 2 hours of increasingly uncomfortable questioning directed primarily at Richardson. Judge Vasquez methodically traced the timeline of events. Westridge's knowledge of the financial connections, Richardson's meeting with Judge Blake, the recusal, and the improper direct contact with Eleanor Michaels. The judge's questions revealed that she had done independent research beyond the materials Pamela provided, uncovering additional connections that even Jessica Winters had missed. Throughout the interrogation, Richardson maintained that all actions had been proper, if perhaps poorly timed, but his usual confident demeanor gave way to defensive formality as Vasquez continued to press on inconsistencies in his explanations. By the hearing's conclusion, the judge had established a troubling pattern without explicitly accusing anyone of ethical violations. Her closing remarks, delivered with calm authority, made clear that while she would not refer the matter for disciplinary review at this stage, she was ordering a complete restart of the proceedings with heightened scrutiny of any communication between parties. The case would begin anew before her, with all previous rulings vacated, including Pamela's contempt fine, and with strict parameters for conduct going forward. As they left chambers, Richardson avoided eye contact with Pamela, his rigid posture betraying the professional setback he had just experienced. For all his legal brilliance, he had miscalculated in assuming that procedural maneuvering would go unchallenged, and now his client's position was potentially weaker than before. The reset of the case created an unexpected opportunity for Eleanor Michaels that extended beyond the courtroom. With media attention intensifying around the procedural irregularities, though the specific financial connections remained under seal, public sentiment solidified behind the beloved bookshop owner. Local preservation societies organized rallies, social media campaigns highlighted the cultural importance of the space, and even city council members began making public statements supporting efforts to protect historic community institutions from development. Eleanor's bookshop saw a surge in customers expressing solidarity through purchases, temporarily alleviating the financial pressures that had made her vulnerable to Westridge's tactics in the first place. Pamela recognized that this public relations dimension, while not legally dispositive, created leverage that could potentially lead to settlement on favorable terms. Instead of filing the expected amended complaint immediately, she advised Eleanor to use this window to explore community-based solutions that might provide alternatives to protracted litigation. Working with a local urban planning professor and a historic preservation architect who volunteered their services, Pamela and Eleanor developed a comprehensive proposal that reimagined the entire block where the bookshop stood. Rather than positioning the historic building as an obstacle to development, their plan incorporated it as the centerpiece of a mixed-use project that would preserve the bookshop while still allowing for significant new construction. The proposal included affordable housing units, commercial space, and a community center, all designed to complement rather than overshadow the historic structure. Financial projections demonstrated that such an integrated approach could potentially deliver returns comparable to Westridge's original plans while generating significantly greater community support and expedited approval processes. Armed with architectural renderings, economic impact studies, and expressions of interest from alternative developers, Pamela reached out to Westridge's in-house counsel, deliberately bypassing Richardson, to suggest a meeting to discuss potential resolution outside the courtroom. Victor Harrington's initial reaction to the alternative development proposal was predictably dismissive. Westridge had built its business model on maximizing return per square foot, and preservation-focused designs typically meant reduced density and lower profit margins. But as Pamela walked him through the financial projections, highlighting the reduced legal costs, accelerated approval timeline, and positive publicity benefits, his objections became more measured and specific rather than categorical. The turning point came when she presented letters from 3 city council members indicating their enthusiasm for fast-tracking approvals for the integrated design approach, a stark contrast to the lengthy battles Westridge typically faced for large-scale demolition projects. Development timelines, Harrington acknowledged, often impacted profitability more significantly than slight reductions in square footage. By the meeting's conclusion, he had agreed to have Westridge's architectural team review the proposal and provide feedback within 2 weeks. Not a commitment, but a meaningful engagement that represented significant progress from their previous intransigence. What neither Pamela nor Eleanor anticipated was the community's reaction to news of these discussions. A local journalist who had been covering the case from the beginning reported on the alternative development concept, including the detailed renderings that had been shared with Westridge. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Local businesses near the bookshop pledged support through a joint letter endorsing the integrated approach. A prominent regional foundation that supported historical preservation announced interest in providing matching grants for restoration aspects of the project. Most significantly, 3 smaller developers with track records in adaptive reuse projects contacted Eleanor directly, expressing interest in partnering on the project should Westridge decline to proceed. The groundswell created precisely the competitive pressure that Pamela had hoped might eventually develop but had not expected so quickly or forcefully. When Harrington called 3 days ahead of their agreed timeline, his tone had shifted from reluctant consideration to pragmatic engagement. Westridge wasn't prepared to adopt the alternative plan wholesale, he explained, but was open to meaningful negotiations toward a compromise approach that would preserve the bookshop while allowing for substantial development. The first substantive settlement discussion was scheduled for the following week, with Judge Vasquez's blessing to pause the litigation timeline while these talks proceeded. For the first time since receiving the eviction notice, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that her beloved bookshop might actually survive. The settlement conference, held in the neutral territory of a downtown law firm's conference room, brought together the core parties along with their expanded teams. Westridge arrived with architects, financial analysts, and project managers in addition to their legal counsel, signaling serious engagement with the process. Maxwell Richardson was noticeably absent, replaced by Westridge's in-house counsel, Sarah Chun, whose reputation for creative problem-solving contrasted sharply with Richardson's adversarial approach. Pamela had assembled her own team of experts, many working pro bono out of commitment to the preservation cause. The conversation began stiffly, with each side presenting modifications to the original compromise proposal, but gradually evolved into a collaborative dialogue around specific design elements and financial structures. By mid-afternoon, the architects from opposing sides were sketching alternatives together on a shared whiteboard, while financial teams exchanged spreadsheets identifying areas of potential compromise. The conceptual breakthrough came when Eleanor herself, who had been quietly observing from the corner, interrupted a technical discussion about setback requirements to suggest an unexpected solution. What if the building's historical significance could be preserved while still allowing for additional height? The preservation statutes protected the structure itself and its community function, but nothing prevented adding floors above the original building provided the architectural integrity was maintained. Her suggestion, to preserve the bookshop completely while building upward with a respectful, visually distinct addition, created a pathway that addressed both Westridge's density requirements and preservation goals. The architectural teams immediately began exploring the feasibility, discovering that such an approach could potentially increase the project's overall value by creating distinctive upper-floor residences with historical character below, commanding premium prices in a market saturated with generic luxury apartments. By the session's end, the framework of an agreement had emerged. The bookshop would remain intact and operational throughout construction. Westridge would develop additional floors above and adjacent buildings alongside, and Eleanor would receive a partial ownership stake in the overall project in exchange for certain air rights. The weeks following the initial settlement conference involved intense negotiations over details, with occasional impasses that threatened to derail the process. Each time, Judge Vasquez's firm but patient case management kept the parties engaged, setting clear deadlines and expressing her preference for resolution over continued litigation while never pressuring either side toward specific terms. Pamela, drawing on her growing network of support, brought in specialized consultants to address technical challenges as they arose. A structural engineer who developed innovative support systems that would protect the historic building during construction, a cultural heritage specialist who documented elements requiring preservation, and a financial analyst who structured the ownership arrangement to protect Eleanor's long-term interests. Throughout this process, Pamela demonstrated skills far beyond traditional litigation, functioning as project manager, mediator, and strategic advisor, while maintaining the legal leverage that kept Westridge at the table in good faith. The settlement agreement, finalized after nearly 2 months of negotiations, represented a victory far more comprehensive than Pamela could have achieved through even the most favorable court ruling. Eleanor's bookshop would remain not just intact but revitalized, with funding for restoration of historical elements and expanded community programming space. The development would proceed with a design that respected and highlighted the historic structure while still delivering significant new housing and commercial space. Most importantly, Eleanor received both guaranteed tenancy at controlled rates and a minority ownership interest in the overall project, ensuring long-term financial stability that addressed the underlying economic pressures that had made her vulnerable to eviction in the first place. When the parties presented the agreement to Judge Vasquez for approval and incorporation into a consent decree, her usual judicial reserve gave way to visible approval. The creative solution represented the legal system at its best, addressing conflicting interests through problem-solving rather than winner-take-all adjudication. As the hearing concluded, Vasquez made a point of acknowledging Pamela's exceptional advocacy, noting that the outcome reflected not just legal skill, but the ability to envision solutions beyond conventional parameters. The public recognition from a respected judge helped erase the professional stigma of the earlier contempt fine, replacing it with a reputation for innovative problem-solving that would shape the trajectory of Pamela's practice. The positive resolution of Eleanor's case marked a professional turning point for Pamela, though its immediate aftermath brought little respite from challenges. While the settlement provided long-term security for the bookshop, implementing its complex provisions required continued vigilance and legal guidance. Westridge, though committed to the agreement's terms, still approached various details with a profit-maximizing mindset that occasionally required Pamela's intervention to maintain the spirit of the arrangement. Meanwhile, her father's health gradually improved, but his recovery necessitated ongoing care and eventually a transition to assisted living, adding personal responsibilities to her already demanding schedule. Through it all, Pamela maintained the small practice she had built, balancing existing client obligations with the increased demand resulting from her newly elevated profile in the legal community. Former clients reached out to reconnect, local businesses sought her counsel on development-related matters, and community organizations requested her representation in preservation efforts across the city. 6 months after the settlement, as construction scaffolding began to rise around the carefully protected bookshop, Pamela received an unexpected invitation to speak at the State Bar Association's annual conference on a panel addressing creative approaches to property disputes. The invitation came from Judge Marina Vasquez herself, who had been impressed enough by Pamela's work to recommend her as a presenter alongside established experts in the field. The recognition represented professional validation that helped counterbalance the lingering whispers about her earlier procedural missteps with Judge Blake. Preparing for the panel forced Pamela to reflect systematically on the strategies she had employed, not just the legal arguments but the coalition-building, creative problem-solving, and human-centered approach that had ultimately produced a result beyond what conventional litigation could have achieved. As she organized her thoughts into a presentation framework, she realized she had developed a methodology that could be applied to other scenarios where community interests and development pressures collided. The conference presentation exceeded expectations, with attorneys from across the state engaging deeply with Pamela's approach, her particular emphasis on identifying the underlying interests beyond legal positions. Understanding that Westridge ultimately cared about project timelines and return on investment rather than specifically demolishing the bookshop, resonated with practitioners facing similar conflicts. During the networking reception afterward, Pamela found herself approached by Julia Winters, managing partner at Winters & Associates, one of the city's most respected boutique firms specializing in land use and development law. The conversation began with compliments about her presentation but quickly evolved into something more substantive. Winters had been following Eleanor's case with professional interest and had been impressed not just by the outcome but by the process through which Pamela had achieved it. Her firm, Winters explained, had been considering expanding their practice to include a community advocacy division that would focus on balancing development with preservation and community interests, not opposing development but shaping it toward more integrated outcomes. Would Pamela be interested in discussing potential collaboration? The possibility of joining an established firm represented both opportunity and dilemma for Pamela. Her independent practice had been built on direct client relationships and the freedom to select cases based on personal values rather than billable targets. Yet the resources, mentorship, and broader impact possible through a firm platform were undeniably attractive. Winters seemed to anticipate her concerns, emphasizing that they were interested precisely because of her values-driven approach, not despite it. The proposed division would maintain significant autonomy, with Pamela helping shape its direction and client selection criteria. After weeks of careful consideration and detailed discussions about structure, compensation, and autonomy, Pamela agreed to bring her practice under the Winters and Associates umbrella while maintaining primary responsibility for her existing clients, including ongoing oversight of Eleanor's settlement implementation. The arrangement provided infrastructure support and collaborative opportunities, while preserving the elements of independence that had drawn her to solo practice initially. Eleanor Michael's reaction to Pamela's new professional arrangement balanced happiness for her attorney's success with concern about continued representation. The relationship they had developed went beyond typical attorney-client parameters, evolving into a partnership grounded in shared values and mutual respect. Pamela assured Eleanor that their work together would continue uninterrupted, with the firm's resources actually enhancing her ability to monitor compliance with settlement terms and address any implementation challenges. To demonstrate this commitment, Pamela arranged a meeting between Eleanor and Julia Winters at the bookshop itself, where the three women discussed the vision for community-centered development advocacy that had emerged from Eleanor's case. As construction proceeded around them, carefully controlled to minimize disruption to the bookshop's operations as specified in the settlement, they outlined initiatives that could help other small businesses facing similar pressures. The bookshop would serve as both model and meeting place for a new coalition bringing together business owners, preservation advocates, and development interests around shared visions for community growth. Eleanor's eyes brightened as she envisioned her beloved space taking on yet another community function, not just surviving as a historical remnant but evolving into an active participant in shaping the neighborhood's future while honoring its past. For Pamela, watching her client transform from potential victim to empowered advocate represented success more meaningful than any legal victory or professional advancement. She had helped create not just a settlement but a template for addressing similar conflicts throughout the city, turning a seemingly straightforward eviction defense into a catalyst for systemic change in how development and community interests intersected. 1 year after the landmark settlement, Michael's memories and manuscripts had become both a functioning bookshop and a living case study in sustainable urban development. The construction that had initially threatened to erase the historic building had instead embraced it, creating a striking architectural contrast between the preserved Victorian structure and the modern glass and steel extension rising above it. Monthly tours brought urban planning students, developers, and community advocates through the space to witness firsthand how historical preservation and new development could coexist harmoniously. Eleanor, energized rather than diminished by the experience, had expanded her community programming, partnering with local schools to establish literacy initiatives and creating a dedicated section showcasing local authors and regional history. The bookshop's financial stability, secured through the ownership stake in the larger development, allowed her to focus on cultural impact rather than merely surviving month to month. For Pamela, who still visited regularly despite her increasingly demanding schedule, the transformed space represented the most tangible validation of her approach to legal advocacy, one that measured success not just by courtroom victories, but by real-world outcomes that served both individual clients and broader community interests. Pamela's professional trajectory had accelerated dramatically since joining Winters and Associates. The community advocacy division she headed had grown from a conceptual initiative to a thriving practice area with 3 additional attorneys and a dedicated support staff. They had successfully negotiated settlements in 5 development disputes using variations of the model pioneered in Eleanor's case, each time finding creative solutions that balance preservation with progress. Rather than positioning themselves as anti-development crusaders, they had cultivated relationships with forward-thinking developers interested in community-integrated approaches, sometimes even bringing these developers into projects where more adversarial companies had initially held positions. This collaborative rather than purely adversarial approach had raised eyebrows among traditional advocacy groups at first, but the results, preserved community spaces, affordable housing components, and expedited project timelines, gradually won over skeptics from across the political spectrum. The practice model had proven not just ideologically satisfying but economically viable, with developers willing to pay premium rates for representation that could transform community opposition into partnership. The increasing prominence of Pamela's work inevitably brought her back into professional proximity with Judge Harrison Blake. Following his recusal from Eleanor's case and the subsequent settlement, Blake had maintained a low profile, continuing his judicial duties while avoiding any cases involving Westridge Development or related entities. Courthouse rumors suggested he had been deeply affected by the near-miss ethical scandal, becoming even more stringent about disclosure and recusal standards than court rules required. When Pamela appeared before him on an unrelated matter 18 months after the Michaels case, the tension was palpable. Blake maintained rigid professional formality during the proceedings, neither acknowledging their previous interactions nor demonstrating any bias, positive or negative. His rulings were meticulously supported by legal reasoning, as if anticipating potential scrutiny of any decision involving the attorney who had uncovered his undisclosed connections. For her part, Pamela approached the case with exemplary preparation and procedural correctness, ensuring that no legitimate grounds for criticism could arise from her conduct. The professional détente was uncomfortable but functional, two legal professionals carrying the weight of a complicated history while maintaining the decorum their roles demanded. The turning point in their strained professional relationship came unexpectedly, during a Law Day ceremony honoring Judge Vasquez's elevation to the Court of Appeals. In her acceptance speech, Vasquez spoke eloquently about the evolution of her own understanding of justice through cases that challenged conventional legal approaches, specifically citing the Michaels bookshop settlement as an example of law serving community needs through creativity rather than rigid application of rules. At the reception afterward, Pamela found herself face-to-face with Judge Blake at the refreshment table, the first time they had encountered each other outside a courtroom since the dramatic conclusion of Eleanor's case. After an awkward moment of mutual recognition, Blake spoke quietly, asking if she had a moment to step onto the adjacent terrace. The conversation that followed was brief but transformative. Blake acknowledged, without explicitly referencing the financial connections that had necessitated his recusal, that her handling of the situation had demonstrated integrity. She had raised legitimate procedural concerns without seeking to damage his reputation through public allegations. He had reflected deeply on the experience, he admitted, recognizing that his initial harshness toward her procedural missteps had perhaps reflected an unconscious displacement of his own discomfort with potential conflicts he had rationalized as insignificant. The conversation wasn't an apology exactly, but it represented a mutual recognition of complex ethical terrain navigated, imperfectly, but ultimately honorably by both parties. As they rejoined the reception, the tension between them had noticeably diminished, replaced by the professional respect of colleagues who had glimpsed each other's fundamental commitment to legal integrity despite human stumbles along the way. The ripple effects of the Michaels case extended beyond Pamela's practice and professional relationships, influencing policy developments at the municipal level. The City Council, impressed by the successful integration of preservation and development in what became known locally as the Bookshop Building, initiated a comprehensive review of zoning regulations and historic preservation ordinances. Pamela was invited to serve on the advisory committee, bringing her practical experience to bear on policy formulation. The resulting recommendations, adopted after months of public hearings and stakeholder negotiations, created new incentive structures for developers who incorporated historic structures into their projects, streamlined approval processes for integrated designs, and established clearer criteria for determining cultural significance. These policy changes institutionalized approaches that had emerged through the particular circumstances of Eleanor's case, creating pathways for similar resolutions without requiring the extraordinary legal and community mobilization that had been necessary to save the bookshop. 2 years into her role at Winters and Associates, Pamela received an offer that presented her with a professional crossroads. The governor, seeking to diversify the state's administrative law courts with practitioners experienced in finding balanced solutions to complex disputes, had nominated her to fill a vacancy on the State Land Use Board of Appeals. The position represented both recognition of her expertise and an opportunity to influence development policy at a systemic level, shaping precedents that would guide local governments throughout the state. The appointment would require stepping back from direct advocacy and embracing a more neutral judicial role, a significant shift for someone who had built her reputation on creative advocacy. After deep reflection and conversations with mentors including Judge Vasquez, Pamela decided to accept the nomination, recognizing that her experience finding common ground between competing interests had prepared her well for the balanced judgment the position required. Julia Winters, though disappointed to lose a valued partner, supported the decision, noting that Pamela's influence on their practice model had become sufficiently embedded that her approach would continue to guide their work even in her absence. The confirmation hearings before the State Senate Judiciary Committee brought Pamela full circle, reconnecting her with the Michaels case in unexpected ways. Among those testifying in support of her nomination was Victor Harrington, whose perspective had evolved significantly since their initial adversarial encounter. The bookshop building had become a showpiece in Westridge's portfolio, featured prominently in their marketing materials as an example of their commitment to community-integrated development. The project's financial success, units in the building commanded premium prices due to their unique character and the cultural amenity of the bookshop, had convinced Harrington and his investors that preservation-minded development could enhance rather than undermine profitability. His testimony described Pamela as a formidable but fair negotiator who helped his company see opportunities in community engagement rather than merely obstacles to overcome. Following Harrington at the witness table was Eleanor Michaels herself, who spoke movingly about Pamela's commitment to understanding the human dimensions of legal disputes. The bookshop owner described how Pamela had translated abstract legal principles into protection for a community institution that served children learning to read, elderly residents seeking connection, and a neighborhood maintaining its cultural identity amid rapid change. The most surprising testimony came from Judge Harrison Blake, whose appearance had not been announced in advance. Speaking with the measured authority that had defined his judicial career, Blake addressed not the specific details of the Michaels case but the broader qualities he had observed in Pamela's legal practice. He described her as exemplifying the highest ideals of the profession: thorough preparation, creative problem-solving, and unwavering commitment to her clients' interests while maintaining absolute ethical integrity. Without directly referencing their own complicated history, he noted that true legal excellence included the wisdom to recognize when litigation alone might not best serve justice, and the courage to pursue alternative paths even when they required more effort than conventional approaches. His endorsement, coming from a judge widely respected for his tough standards and ethical rigor, carried particular weight with the committee members. As the hearing concluded, the Judiciary Committee chair announced an unanimous vote to recommend confirmation, praising Pamela for bridging ideological divides that often characterize development disputes. The bookshop case that had begun with a contempt fine had ultimately revealed not just Pamela's legal abilities, but her capacity to transform adversarial encounters into opportunities for understanding and mutual benefit, precisely the quality needed in the quasi-judicial role she would now assume. Pamela's transition from advocate to adjudicator required significant adjustment. The habits developed over years of zealous representation needed to be tempered with the balanced perspective her new role demanded. She maintained her commitment to seeking solutions that satisfied competing legitimate interests but now did so by guiding parties toward their own resolutions rather than advocating directly for particular outcomes. Her deep understanding of both development imperatives and preservation concerns allowed her to ask questions that helped parties identify potential common ground they might otherwise overlook. When formal decisions were required, her written opinions reflected careful consideration of all perspectives while providing clear guidance for future cases. Within a year of her appointment, attorneys appearing before the Land Use Board had begun specifically requesting her as the presiding administrative law judge in complex cases, recognizing that her approach often led to more durable and satisfying resolutions than traditional winner-take-all adjudication. The 5th anniversary of the bookshop building's completion brought an opportunity to reflect on the case's lasting impact. The Washington State Bar Association organized a symposium titled Beyond Adversarial Justice: New Models for Development Disputes, featuring Pamela, Eleanor, and representatives from both development and preservation communities. The event was held in the community room of Michaels Memories and Manuscripts, now expanded into previously unused areas of the historic building as specified in the settlement agreement. As participants gathered among bookshelves and beneath the carefully preserved architectural details, the space itself embodied the symposium's theme: physical proof that apparent conflicts between progress and preservation often reflected limited imagination rather than truly irreconcilable interests. Eleanor, now in her 70s but still energetically involved in the bookshop's daily operations, welcomed attendees with obvious pride in what the space represented and in her own unexpected role as a catalyst for changing approaches to development disputes throughout the region. Pamela's keynote address traced the evolution from her initial conventional legal strategy, fighting the eviction through procedural and substantive challenges, to the more integrated approach that ultimately prevailed. She credited Eleanor's steadfast commitment to the bookshop's community function for inspiring the search for solutions beyond what courts could provide through traditional remedies. The creative breakthrough, she explained, came from reframing the fundamental question from, "Can this bookshop legally be evicted?" to, "How might this development proceed while preserving what makes this space valuable to its community?" This shift in perspective had allowed identification of interests beyond positions, revealing potential solutions invisible within the narrow constraints of adversarial procedure. The approach required more initial investment of time and creative energy than conventional litigation, but ultimately delivered superior outcomes for all stakeholders. The developer gained expedited approvals and premium pricing, the community retained its cultural anchor, and the legal system resolved a dispute that might otherwise have consumed years of contentious proceedings. As the symposium concluded, Pamela found herself standing beside Eleanor near the bookshop's front window, watching as attorneys, developers, preservationists, and community advocates continued their discussions in small groups throughout the space. The scene represented everything she had hoped might emerge from that difficult period 5 years earlier. Not just a saved bookshop, but a fundamentally altered conversation about how communities could evolve while honoring their past. Eleanor squeezed her hand gently and nodded toward a tall, distinguished man examining a display of local history books. Judge Harrison Blake, who had accepted the invitation to attend despite his initial reluctance. His presence completed the circle of reconciliation that had gradually formed among the principal figures in the case, each having grown through the experience in different ways. As Blake turned and met Pamela's gaze across the room, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement, a gesture that contained within it recognition of how far they had both come from that autumn morning when he had levied a contempt fine against an attorney he had dismissed as merely careless. That fine, intended as a lesson in procedural discipline, had instead initiated a journey that transformed not just Pamela's career, but her understanding of what legal practice at its best could accomplish. Standing in the thriving bookshop that existed because she had found a path beyond conventional legal boundaries, surrounded by colleagues now inspired to seek similar creative resolutions, Pamela Bondi embraced the beautiful irony that her greatest professional triumph had emerged from what had initially appeared to be her most humiliating setback. The story of Pamela Bondi and Eleanor Michaels' bookshop continued to resonate throughout legal and development circles long after the physical structure had been secured. What began as a routine eviction case transformed into a template for approaching seemingly intractable conflicts between preservation and progress, demonstrating that creativity and genuine engagement with underlying interests could reveal solutions invisible within traditional adversarial frameworks. For Pamela, the journey from receiving a contempt fine to becoming a respected administrative law judge reflected more than professional advancement. It represented an evolution in how she understood the purpose and potential of legal practice. The law, she had discovered, functioned best not merely as a weapon in zero-sum battles, but as a framework for structuring conversations about competing legitimate interests and values. Eleanor's bookshop flourished in its dual role as community institution and development showcase. The reading programs, author events, and book clubs continued to provide cultural connection points for neighborhood residents across generations, while the innovative structural design that integrated historic and modern elements attracted architecture students and urban planners from across the country. The success of the bookshop building prompted Westridge Development to incorporate similar preservation-minded approaches into subsequent projects, discovering that distinctive character and community integration could create market advantages worth the additional design complexity. Other developers followed suit, gradually shifting industry practices throughout the region toward models that viewed historic structures as potential assets rather than obstacles. Judge Harrison Blake, approaching retirement after 3 decades on the bench, incorporated lessons from the Michaels case into his judicial education programs for new judges, emphasizing the importance of transparent disclosure and the dangers of rationalizing potential conflicts. His evolving friendship with Pamela, initially tentative but growing more comfortable over time, demonstrated the resilience of professional relationships when built on mutual respect and the shared value of integrity. Judge Marina Vasquez, from her position on the Court of Appeals, continued to champion creative resolution models, citing the bookshop case in opinions encouraging lower courts to facilitate settlement processes that addressed underlying needs rather than focusing exclusively on legal positions. On quiet evenings when court sessions had concluded and administrative responsibilities were temporarily set aside, Pamela occasionally visited the bookshop, selecting a volume from the shelves and settling into one of the leather chairs that had witnessed so much of her professional journey. Surrounded by the peaceful hum of community members engaged with books and each other, she would reflect on the serendipitous sequence that had led her here. How a missed filing deadline and a seemingly punitive fine had ultimately opened doors to approaches and relationships she could never have anticipated. The contempt fine that had once felt like professional humiliation had instead been the catalyst for her greatest contributions. In this unexpected outcome lay perhaps the most important lesson of her career. That setbacks, when approached with integrity and creative resilience, could reveal pathways to justice more promising than those visible from conventional perspectives. As evening shadows lengthened across the bookshop's original hardwood floors, Pamela would smile at the beautiful symmetry of it all. How a case that began with a judge fining her for perceived carelessness had revealed her true capabilities, not just as a technician of legal procedure, but as an architect of solutions that honored both the letter and spirit of what law at its best could accomplish.